So, ever wonder how a simple drum beat, a musical rhythm, could actually be seen as a massive threat to an entire government or economic system? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into two totally fascinating underground movements that literally terrified the powers that be. We're talking about the raw, gritty punk scene of 1980s East Germany, the GDR, and then the hypnotic, massive techno and cybertribe culture of the 1990s in the West. Now, these two might be separated by a whole decade and exist in completely different political worlds, but as you'll see, the arc of their rebellion is shockingly similar.
All right, let's take a quick look at our roadmap. We are going to break down this universal life cycle of musical subversion into 5 distinct phases: beats of rebellion, DIY identity, repression by the system, the threat of co-optation, and finally, the never-ending rhythm. Let's get into it.
Kicking things off with Section 1, Beats of Rebellion. Let's look at the origins of these movements and how these kids sought an escape from a completely pre-programmed life.
Picture this. It's the late 70s, and teenagers in East Berlin are secretly tuning into Western radio broadcasts, like the BBC, catching these aggressive early punk tracks. By 1980, what started as just a few isolated cliques of kids hanging out and listening to loud music exploded into a full-on movement. You have to remember, they were incredibly frustrated by this deeply regimented life the socialist state had mapped out for them, straight from state youth groups into the military and then right into state-planned labor. Punk was their absolute rejection of that script, and it was so persistent that by 1986, it forced the state to actually shift its tactics.
Now, fast forward just a decade, and we hit a radically different sound. It's electronic, it's loop-driven, it's totally faceless, but it was born from that exact same frustration with the mainstream. After a lot of the political activism in the 80s left young people feeling burned out and disenfranchised, the 90s techno scene blew up as this massive search for individual freedom and ecstatic community. It was a total escape from the rigid, highly commercialized structures of the West. Basically, they traded traditional protest marches for massive, never-ending dance floors.
And this mindset is captured perfectly by groups like Underground Resistance in Detroit. They stated, "Underground resistance is the designation for a movement that seeks change through noisy revolution. By using the energy potential of sound, we will smash this wall." That aggressively boundary-breaking attitude completely mirrors those early GDR punks. They didn't just see their music as something to dance to. It was literally an auditory weapon meant to shatter social and racial walls. Both movements fundamentally believed that sound had the energy to force a massive shift in human consciousness.
Moving right along to Section 2, DIY identity and expression. Because, let's face it, when you're locked out of the mainstream, you have to build your own world from scratch.
True rebellion takes some serious resourcefulness, right? And the GDR punks used the most bizarre, creative DIY methods to build an identity that the state absolutely despised. I mean, they couldn't just walk into a trendy Western fashion boutique. So, what did they do? They wore heavy factory safety boots, ripped up old suits. And get this, because they couldn't buy bright hair dye in East Germany, they found out that an over-the-counter foot fungus medicine would actually turn their hair bright purple. No way, right? They spiked their hair using sugar water and gave each other DIY tattoos using India ink and knitting needles. It was this incredibly raw visual middle finger to the state's idea of the clean-cut socialist citizen.
And to share their music, both of these movements had to totally bypass the traditional industry. In East Germany, the state had an ironclad monopoly on vinyl records, so punks turned to underground cassette tape trading. These tiny DIY labels ran purely on idealism, dubbing maybe 20 to 200 copies and selling them at secret underground gigs. On the flip side, in the 90s West, techno DJs totally rejected commercial pop song structures by continuously mixing vinyl loops. DJs like Jeff Mills stripped away the standard verses and choruses, creating these endless, mesmerizing atmospheres that kept the dance floor moving without a single pause. Both methods completely cut out the corporate or state middleman.
And just like those punks were claiming abandoned buildings for their secret concerts, the 90s cybertribes and Goa trans movements were out there transforming nature and empty warehouses into spiritual, communal dance floors. They envisioned these decentralized networks to completely replace top-down authority. By blending modern electronic synthesizers with ancient tribal trance rituals, they were creating what they called temporary autonomous zones. Basically fleeting little pockets of total freedom where the rules of the outside world simply did not apply.
Which brings us to Section 3, repression by the system. What happens when the powers that be realize this music isn't just a passing phase?
Well, in East Germany, the state's extreme paranoia showed up in some incredibly elastic, crazy laws. Terms translating to rowdyism and unlawful assembly meant you didn't even have to commit a real crime. Literally, just gathering together with spiked hair and trashed clothes was enough for the Stasi, the secret police, to classify you as a threat to the state order. Punks could face up to 5 years in prison simply for standing in public with the wrong haircut.
And the craziest part? 900. That was the official number of registered punks in the entire GDR back in 1984. Just 900 kids. To put that into perspective, that is a tiny, tiny community. Yet the government viewed them as such a massive, fundamental threat to their entire ideology that they unleashed their most advanced intelligence apparatus against them.
The Stasi didn't just arrest people, they deployed straight-up psychological warfare to rot the punk community from the inside out. They recruited informants, known as IMs, to infiltrate bands. They would literally blackmail teenage punks, threatening them with prison if they didn't spy on their best friends. They used preemptive military drafts to isolate young men, banned them from city centers during holidays, and actively spread disinformation to destroy the trust that held the underground together. It was absolutely ruthless.
Well, wait. Jump forward 10 years to the UK, and we see an entirely different democratic government doing the exact same thing, just using different tools. When unlicensed free raves started drawing tens of thousands of people, the conservative government passed the Criminal Justice Bill in 1994. This explicitly targeted nomadic groups like the Spiral Tribe and, quite literally, the repetitive beats of techno. They effectively criminalized the simple act of gathering to dance anywhere outside of a state-sanctioned, taxable venue.
All right, Section 4, the threat of co-optation. We've seen the iron fist, but what happens when the system decides, hey, if we can't beat them, let's just absorb them?
This is where it gets super interesting. It's a fascinating comparison between a communist state trying to control culture and capitalist industries trying to monetize it. By the late 80s, the GDR completely shifted tactics. They started allowing state-sanctioned punk radio shows and released music on their official state label. They were trying to pacify the youth by giving them a supervised platform. Meanwhile, in the 90s West, massive corporate sponsors, we're talking cigarette and beverage companies, started slapping their logos on raves. They transformed raw underground techno into radio-friendly pop techno, basically looking at this once radical subculture as nothing more than a wealthy demographic of consumers to be marketed to.
You really see this dynamic when you look at the Berlin Love Parade. It started in 1989 as this tiny, spirit-driven street protest with just 150 people marching for peace and musical understanding. But give it 10 years? By 1999, it had mutated into this massive, highly commercialized corporate event with 1 million attendees. 1 million! And while on the surface that looked like a huge triumph for the culture, a lot of people in the underground felt it was the ultimate death of its original subversive spirit.
There's a quote from the subversive label Praxis Records that really hits the nail on the head. They said, "The industry managed to apply its old strategies to techno. Mega raves and pop techno are total conformism." It just perfectly captures that deep frustration. The very musical structures that were designed to break down barriers had been totally hijacked. It was conformism just dressed up in neon lighting.
Finally, Section 5, the never-ending rhythm. What happens when the literal wall falls, or the new laws force you out? How does the rhythm actually survive?
Well, when the Berlin Wall fell, it totally disoriented the GDR punks. The state vanished overnight, and suddenly they had no enemy. Christian Lawrence from the punk band Feeling B summed it up beautifully. Through the change of system, we somehow had no enemy anymore. If you really want to make trouble, you have to bring up something new. So we founded Rammstein. They had to invent entirely new ways to provoke a newly unified society, so they evolved the sound, leaned into industrial aesthetics, and created a band that became a massive global phenomenon.
And a very similar thing happened with the UK rave scene. Faced with heavy police repression and that criminal justice bill, groups like the Spiral Tribe didn't just throw their hands up and surrender. Absolutely not. They packed their massive speaker rigs into trucks, left the UK entirely, and went completely nomadic. They took their free party sound system across Europe, sustaining their subculture and making sure that the rhythm of the cyber tribe stayed alive, always staying just one step ahead of the authorities.
So, to wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a thought to chew on. We've seen how states use strict laws to crush subversion, and how corporations throw money around to buy it out. So looking at our current era, a world where literally every movement is instantly monetized, packaged, and digitally tracked, how do we create genuine resistance today? In this hyper-surveilled reality, where does the true underground actually hide? Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope this deep dive has given you a completely new way to listen to the rhythm of rebellion,